Good morning, Kathy. How are you?
Good morning. Well, how are you?
Very good, very good. Well, thank you so much for carving out the time to join me on this series of Sentientist conversations. It's great to have a chance to chat. And we were introduced, at least virtually, by a previous guest, Randy Abate. So it's brilliant to, I guess, talk to, in a sense, you're his partner in crime or his boss. Or let's find that out later on. But so it's great to be in touch. And as you know already, this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions, the question of what's real, how should we understand the universe, and what and who matters, the questions of ethics. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize this really simple, pluralistic worldview I'm calling sentientism, which suggests we should take a naturalistic approach to understanding the world around us using evidence and reason and hopefully a healthy dose of humility. And when it comes to that question of moral scope and who gets to matter and count in our ethics, the clue is in the name. Every sentient being, any being that has the capacity to suffer, flourish, or experience, should be included in our moral consideration. But I'm talking in these conversations to people who agree and disagree with different aspects of that. So it'll be fascinating to understand your own philosophical journey, where you are now, and the implications for the future. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work?
Well, thank you. So first, thank you for having the conversation with me, and I thank Randy for the connection. And we can talk about our work together in a little bit. But yeah, my work is probably best described as for the last 30 years, I've been an animal law, not always 30 years, 22 years, animal law professor. But I've been an academic, a legal academic for 30 years, and a legal practitioner, because the kind of teaching I do is clinical teaching, which means we actually handle real cases. So
Yeah.
teaching students how to be lawyers by actually engaging in law. So I had both the practical and the theoretical kind of combined within the law school realm for 30 years. Before and along with that, I've been an activist, sort of a generalized activist, but also increasingly, obviously, an animal activist. So I write, I teach, I do activism in that space, but and we'll talk about this more in a minute, more broadly, sort of in the nonviolent framed space. And so I'm most recently now at GW, having been at Lewis and Clark for 14 years and a number of schools before that, to start the Animal Legal Education Initiative, where we can focus on developing a real sustainable sort of program, if you will, of animal law, both jurisprudence broadly in the world to make it part of the legal conversation generally, because it's still not there, but also to make sure that it's part of the legal education structure, right? So that students have exposure to it and it's not conditioned on whether a teacher wants to do this as, an add-on to their work, or whether school is willing to pay someone outside to come in and teach it, those kinds of things, which is where we're at right now. So to try and make it really sustainably part of the conversation, both for the people who are interested in it, the students and faculty and others, scholars as well, but also to help people who are already in that structure, in that system, understand what they're missing when they're not including these conversations in work they already do, whether that's, property, constitutional law, administrative law, environmental law. So most of the folks in those spaces already have a really specific view, a really specific task right ahead of them. And they don't understand the intersections, right, of the animal law questions. And so this is a project to try to develop resources and assistance to help people see what they're missing in that area, make it easier for them to engage in those conversations in their own domains, in their own sort of jurisprudential spaces.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. It's deeply important work. And there's something about the animal topic, it seems to me, from my amateur perspective, but having interviewed some amazing people, is that it's really hard to stop yourself becoming an activist in some sense when you're an academic in this space, right? Don't seem to be many ivory tower animal advocacy or animal activists, animal academics, right? You sort of inexorably get drawn into, I have to be doing something more direct about this as well. So it seems a theme that will come through.
I think
Yeah.
that's right. I think there are a few who are very, very highly theoretical, and we need folks like that.
Yeah.
And for me, this it came from activism, right? So I started with activism and expanded my circle of compassion, right, to include this conversation. So, but
Interesting.
it is fascinating. I think you're right, because there's something very visceral and very tangible about this, but it's also something, and this is a fascinating insight that I didn't initially have when I started teaching students. This is one area of law where students can do something today if they want, right, to change things. And they're implicated, right? So it's not just a theoretical conversation about what the law should be or, how we should change it. No one's apart from this conversation because it's what we eat, what we wear, all these personal decisions as well as structural, legal, corporate decisions. And so I think that explains the insight that you have about it's hard then not to engage, right, in those spaces and try, hopefully think about doing that respectfully and thoughtfully. But yeah, it's hard to say all day I'm talking about protecting animals and go home and eat them, right? That's a dissonance that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, exactly. And many people are very good at that, maintaining that dissonance. Some even use it as an excuse. And I like to remind people that cognitive dissonance is not an excuse. It's a problem to be challenged. But anyway, but your work, and we'll come back onto this when we talk about the future as well, but it seems really important in this sort of evolution from people even realizing that animal law is a thing at all to it being this extra optional thing, to it being something that is unavoidably integrated with the entire field of legal thinking. And it's a difficult path, but an important one. And your work is central to pushing us in the right direction. So we'll come back to that later. But let's, if it's okay, let's start with this sort of personal philosophical journey. So the first question I like to ask is, what's real? A question of epistemology, really. And for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up originally in society or a family that was maybe more supernaturally minded, religious, spiritual, mystical in their way of thinking about the world, or one that was more maybe scientifically minded, naturalistic, maybe atheist or agnostic in a sense, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time, not just with respect to religion, but broadly how to go about understanding the world around us. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like to tell that story. It'd be fascinating to know.
Sure. Yeah, I was raised in a very Catholic family and also a sort of Republican family here in the United States. Those things don't always go together, but sometimes they do. And so that means for me that my family was a very sort of rules-bounded, status quo kind of family, right? So you did what you were told, you respected authority. And so in an interesting way, they weren't very spiritually religious, but they were very kind of dogmatically religious, right? So we do these things every week and we do these things, you dress a certain way when you go to church. All of us kids went to Catholic school, it was sort of everything about how we were raised. And at the same time, there wasn't a lot of questioning, right? Because you weren't supposed to question, right? So you listened to what your parents said, you listened to what the nun said. So we didn't have deep spiritual kind of conversations about the meaning of God or God in your sort of everyday life. You had answers to those questions, right? So if you had a question, there was already someone who had an answer and you just were supposed to listen to that. Now, interestingly, as a kid, I noted the dissonance again when there were different answers from different people, right? And so coming up in a structure where they're like, there's one way and you're supposed to do it this way. It's like, okay, but like if the nun said this and the priest said that. And I was also coming up, in the mid to late 60s when there was a lot of questioning in society. And so asking my parents questions about like, why don't you like people with long hair, the hippies? Like, why is that bad? I have long hair. Like and the same thing with the nuns. Like, we had sort of singing nuns, like the young nuns who like folk music. And then and Vatican II was happening, right? And so that was a big shift in how people related to the church and religion. So it opened the door for some of that conversation, even though in my home and in my school, that wasn't particularly welcome. But I had a number of really specific examples where it allowed me to question. So for instance, in my diocese, girls were not allowed to be altar servers, right? But my cousins were in Philadelphia. That was in Boston. My cousins were in Philadelphia and they were. And I was like, okay, so one of you guys is wrong.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, along with sort of the foment of the 60s, made me question an awful lot, gave me permission, right? Give me some space to question and to begin to see the distinction between the sort of human bounded rule setting and then these larger conceptualizations, whether they're secular philosophy or moral philosophy. And so as I got into college, I was able to begin to study a little bit more, like Merton and some of the Catholic theologians because I liked a lot of the justice philosophy, right, that comes out of parts of the Catholic tradition. And then there was a lot I didn't like. I didn't like treatment of women. I didn't like treatment of, indigenous people or other people who had vulnerabilities. So there were a lot, and obviously the Catholic Church's stance on war, all kinds of things, right? I was really found problematic. So in college, I began to think about that more and began to question more. And interestingly, that meant I got more involved in the church. Go ahead.
And were the roots of that questioning? So I assume as a young child, you sort of just believed the stuff and assumed this is the way things are. But when you started to question, how much of it was what you were just talking about there? You were starting to see ethical issues that you pushed back on, and how much of it was more sort of facts and evidence and just the story doesn't add up? Was it a bit of both, or was it more the ethical questioning?
It was a bit of both because they were interrelated, right? Because if people who told me that God existed in a certain way were wrong about women, in my view, right, then they could be wrong about God. And so
Yeah.
right. So it made me, so interestingly, and then I found in shortly after college, the Catholic worker movement and the liberation theology. And so I found a lot of things that answered that sort of ethical question from a religious perspective. But interestingly, by that time, I had questioned a lot, right? And
Yeah.
I was so disenchanted with the structure of the Catholic Church, qua church, right? That I was moving away from being sort of just an obedient follower. And so, and this I know is somewhat unique. So I went and talked to the local priest after I had become vegan because I thought, I don't, in the Catholic Church, the transubstantiation, right? So sort of literally drinking the blood and eating the body, right? So I went to the priest and said, and I almost said, I bet I have a question you've never heard before. I wish I had, because it was true. I said, I'm vegan now. I don't eat flesh. I don't drink blood. So if you tell me this is kind of like wink, wink, the body and blood, I can do it. But if it's real, like that's right. If I have to believe it, and I know that's a huge tenet in the Catholic Church that distinguishes them, say, from the Episcopalians or other people. And then I was like, I don't know, right, how to do this anymore, and I can't do it. And the thing that was really striking was not only did he not know how to deal with that, and I said, I know this is crazy, right? This is kind of new. I have one book on animals and vegetarian in Christianity. That's the only source I have, and it doesn't answer this question because it's not a Catholic perspective, but I'll give you this resource. You can look at it. I'll come back, and then we'll talk some more. I came back, and he just kind of blew me off. And I was like, I'm done, right? So if he's not interested in inquiring, if he doesn't have any resources for me, I'm trying to do this work. I actually think I already have the answer, which is I'm out. And so I left the structure of the church. And for me, immediately then I was trying to think, do I replace it with a different spiritual sort of paradigm, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought about Buddhism because that fit some of my ethical frameworks. And for a while, my husband and I, we were like, let's just like chill. We'll just, think about sort of outside of that framework, because we had already made some very deep decisions about how we thought we should live our lives without a religious framework. And eventually we did a little bit of engagement with the Quaker folks, because again, they had a strong peace tradition and it was a very different kind of religious space to be in, but it was nice to be able to engage with people who had a spiritual. But I think by that time, sort of long-winded answer to your question, I had moved away from the need to have guidance from that spiritual space, right?
Yeah.
So I could be at peace with it. So I haven't rejected the idea that there may be some, being, or there's some intentionality to the design of the universe. I don't know what it is, but I've also let go of the need to answer that question for myself. So I can just be like, you know what? It could be there. I don't understand it. I don't have to understand it. What I need to do is try to live in integrity in my life with these concepts that I do bring with me from that tradition, right? And so the ones that I like.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I know I'm sort of picking and choosing, but the things that I think are towards equity and justice, I bring with me, and also learn from lots of other faith traditions. And I like seeing that there's this continuity and this the sameness across religions about just kindness, right? About compassion, about justice. And it's like, okay, like that's again, that's all I need, right? It doesn't need to be pick your people can, and that's totally fine if that's where they want to get that information from. But it gives me enough grounding to say, like, these are good and important qualities. I just need to figure out how to operationalize them in my life.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you. And it's been fascinating, these conversations, because some of my guests still are, if you like, formally religious, and that hasn't shifted much through their lives, but most have moved from that to something else. So there are people who will have those challenges, but then just suppress them and just sort of double down and stick where they are. There are others who will say, well, I'm going to stay within the institutional church, but I will deliberately cherry pick. I will say, well, that's more metaphorical. And, I just need to give the church some more time to overcome the sexism or homophobia or whatever the problem might be. And, we're working on it. It's fine. Others will then reject the institutional religion and say, well, I'm moving away from that. But there is this, and I think you felt and probably still feel some of this pull of there's still something else. There's something about that, something essential about that still has a pull, some sense of the transcendent or the spiritual or something that may be deeper or that goes beyond the natural world. I don't necessarily know what it is, but it feels like that's something that all of the different religions are trying to find their way to. But, old powerful men from centuries ago have sort of messed it up and put their own values around it and got in the way. So they become maybe spiritual, but not religious or something in that space where there is still space for the transcendent and maybe some sort of teleological purpose. But it's much softer. It's no longer a personality with authority telling you what to do. It's more of a broader sense. And others have sort of gone down my boring route of just saying, okay, I'm rejecting the supernatural epistemology and all of the ethics, and I'm quite comfortable having a completely naturalistic grounding for my ethics. But I think where I am probably has an enormous amount in common with the way you described that, because in the way you could say, look, let's look at all of these different religions, and we can still find a common commitment to universal compassion and kindness and caring for others in all of those worldviews. I find exactly that in a naturalistic worldview that I would actually argue probably predated all the religious ones as well. So I think there's so many different ways of getting to this view that whatever the metaphysical nature of the universe is, kindness to others and caring about the perspectives of others is a pretty solid ethical stance to take, regardless of the all the other stuff. Does that? I don't know if that resonates.
It does. Yeah, it does. And so I think, interestingly, I actually don't feel connected to the spiritual, at least personally, world. People have said that I seem like a spiritual person, and I get why they say that, but I do think that comes more from a naturalistic place. And because I was sort of both intellectually and emotionally sort of questioning and distancing, and leaving the church was quite hard because, it was everything I'd been taught for such a long time. And so it was a pretty solid break. And then the idea of like, well, religions teach people to do really horrible things, and they cover, really horrible things. And they teach people to actually also hate other people and, justify war and all kinds of things that I don't like. And I don't think it's necessary, right? I don't think we need this conceptualization to live good lives. So I moved sort of very far, I think, from religion for a long time. What I think I've come to now is because I do want to be compassionate. So I want to leave space for people who feel that way.
Yeah.
And I can have conversations that connect to them based on my background, right? I understand this part of your religion because it's similar, or I, experience something like that. And I don't want to reject people who have that framework, because I do think a lot of people in our movement do, and a lot of people sort of both in the law and animal law and the sciences, right, just say like religion's stupid.
Yeah.
And I fully understand that. My husband's, was training in physics, and he just doesn't even get why people open themselves to these conversations. Yeah. It doesn't work in his brain. And I get that too. But so I just want to kind of make space available so that this isn't just another barrier to conversation and barrier to, working towards shared ideals.
Yeah.
So I think I'm leaving more space for that, but it generally is for other people. It's not what frames my decision making or my sort of day-to-day life. Yeah.
That makes
Yeah,
sense.
because I think you're right. I think not only do the religions follow on sort of a naturalistic, they also sort of follow on and adopt and distort a lot of indigenous, right, ideology. And I think the more that we can make space for some of that traditional thinking, to be part of the conversations about how we engage with the world, it will be very healing, not just for those people, but for all of us. And so I think, again, just broader conceptualizations of what's appropriate conversation is good.
Yeah, I agree. So it sounds like, and one of the other separations that we can make is between a sort of ontological choice between naturalism and supernaturalism, i.e., just a view about whether reality is exhausted by the natural world or whether supernatural stuff exists. And I'm naturalistic there as well. But actually, I think that's less of an interesting question than the method we use, the epistemological method we use. And there, I think that's where it's important to use the evidence and reason. Conceptually, that evidence and that reasoning could lead you to conclude there might be supernatural stuff. Now, for me, it doesn't, because I think as soon as you have evidence of something, it's sort of become part of the natural world because you've got evidence. But other people, including many religious people, say, well, Jamie, my belief is not purely fideistic and it's not dogmatic and it's not arbitrary because I do feel I've got evidence and reason to support it. Whereas others are, it's faith and I don't need evidence. So I think I quite like that methodological focus because, again, it leaves more of that openness that you were implying. And the other thing, we'll come back to the ethical question later on, is a point I make within this sentientism worldview is that the people who disagree with you are sentient beings too, and we should be compassionate to them and open-minded and pluralistic about their worldviews. And that doesn't mean we accept things that don't make sense or that are harmful, but we should absolutely have universal compassion even for people with radically different worldviews. I also like the thing you were talking about with different cultures and ways of thinking, because there's often a really simplistic sort of labeling of traditional and Western ways of thinking that I think is often patronizing and irritating and completely factually wrong too. So there can be this sense that this sort of Western culture is universally rational, naturalistic, and invented universal human rights and compassion, and therefore the other cultures, non-Western or traditional or indigenous, are by definition based on completely unfounded evidence. They're woo, they're mystical, they're arbitrary, they're fabricated, and have really warped ethics. When actually, I think you could flip that question quite easily, because often the central core of, if you like, Western culture is exclusionary ethics and really a strongly fundamentalist Christian worldview that is, I think, unfounded in evidence and reason. When you look at I'm not a scholar in these spaces, you look at traditional and non-Western cultures, they have rich veins of evidence and reason underpinning much of their thought. And there's, ideas and concepts of compassion that run through those cultures, a long, long time before a bunch of people in Europe in the Enlightenment, started formalizing some of these ideas. So I think there's evidence, reason, and compassion in many, many cultures. And then there are things that bump up against those exclusionary ethics and fabricated thinking in many, many cultures too. But
I think that's right. And I think we're learning from the Western scientific rational sort of perspective that some of the things we thought were mystical about earlier or different cultures are actually evidence-based, right?
Yeah.
That they literally understood like astronomy, and they understood that animals were sentient and could communicate, right? And so, and it's taking us hundreds of years after saying like that's silly and ridiculous to go, oh, actually, yeah, they were right? That they understood the essence of plants to make them into medicine or what have you, right? So it's kind of stunning, right? The hubris of sort of Western,
absolutely,
right? So I appreciate rationality, I do, and right when you add the overlay of the ethnic sort of and religious biases, right, that are brought to that rational decision making, you end up with some significant problems. And so untangling that is important. And it's interesting because initially when I was sort of questioning, the first thing I was looking for was, well, evidence, right? So if I can find evidence that Noah existed, that is there really an ark in Turkey and, things like that, just to prove.
There's one in Kentucky.
Yeah. much more recently built, apparently. But then I decided it didn't matter, right? So from the religious perspective, I was not having faith. And so that meant if I couldn't accept without evidence, then I wasn't a faithful person. And so I was sort of going against that tradition. And if I was a rational person, then I had already, rejected that sort of faith-based paradigm. And I end up, at least personally, deciding that I can engage in those conversations for a little bit, and then I decide it doesn't matter, and so it only matters when it matters. So if there's a decision in which deciding between these things matters, then we can have that conversation, and I'm willing to engage. But otherwise, like, I'll let people feel what they feel, and I'll engage the way I feel, and I just don't see the need to. And I'll give you an example in the animal world. So 15, 20 years ago, people spent a lot of time talking about animal rights versus animal welfare. What was the right path? And so I engaged in that for a little while. And I was like, it both. Yes. Like,
Yeah.
we need both. We're not going to get to rights immediately. There's no historical precedent for that anywhere on the globe ever, right? We're not going to actually have a revolution. Never is from one day to the next. It's always an evolution of thinking, of, everything. And so if someone has a plan to get us immediately to full animal rights, yeah, great. I'd love to hear it, but they don't. So improving animal welfare in the meantime is just a pathway. Being attentive, right, to what those mean, and talking but clearly about what people's goals are, recognizing there's divergence, all that's important. But there's just no need, right? It's a problem that did not need to be solved. And so I've just disengaged. And so I feel that way sort of in the spirit, both the teleological and methodological. It's like, if I don't have to go there, I just, I leave that to others, as long as I'm able to communicate with people, able to do my work, able to be respectful, able to learn, right, from these conversations, but not spend a ton of time figuring out, like, I have to have the answer, right? Is there a God? Is there not a God? I just, honestly, I mean, it may be weird. I don't care.
Yeah. And I've heard people use interesting terms like igtheist, or so some people are theists, some people are atheists, some people are agnostics, and some people are just like, it doesn't really have a bearing on the way I live my life either way, right? Almost declaring it, why is it really centrally relevant? I quite like that
that's
approach.
pretty much where I fall, right? So I recognize it's important to other people. It doesn't frame my thinking. There's interesting conversations there, and there's lots of good relationships to be formed. But for me, and especially probably because as a lawyer, again, I want to give people as much sort of freedom to be who and what they are as possible until there's a problem with that, right?
Yeah.
So freedom
so
of
it's
religion,
like pluralism,
but
with firm guardrails. Is that?
Yeah. That's right. So if you're going to be discriminating against women, if you're going to be, and I get that in a religious tradition, you get to do that. But when it gets to be the physical autonomy of a person's body, right? If we're talking about, female genital mutilation, if we're talking about and so thinking about what are my hard stops, like, I'm okay to let you do and say what you want generally, but I do have some hard stops. And it's like, if you're going to physically violate a person's body, that's a hard stop, right? That's, trying to figure out where those conversations end up mattering, and where I, even though I say I want to be compassionate and allow for lots of pluralistic kind of viewpoints, there are points at which I'm going to just say I disagree, and I think that this is a problem, right, that I don't want to support.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you. So one of the themes that comes through these conversations is we're discussing both the sort of what's real epistemology stuff and also the ethical scope question. Is, on the one hand, there's just the philosophy and thinking it through, the critical thinking, and that can bring you to various answers. But it's clear in both of those domains that social norms are phenomenally powerful, both at national, international level, but all the way down to your family as well. And you mentioned it was hard leaving Catholicism. If you're comfortable, it would be interesting to know a little bit more about, was that intellectual and emotional difficulties, social difficulties? How did that play out for you?
Yeah, there were sort of two really big, maybe three big shifts away where I said, all right, I'm actually making a conscious choice to reject what I've been taught, right? Reject that community. And it's like, you don't want to reject the people, but you recognize that it is a rejection. And this is something I talk with students about a lot, because, and I'll come back to separate question, but they'll say, I'm vegan, and I go home and my parents are mad and they don't understand. And I'm like, I'm not telling them they have to be vegan. I just want to be vegan. I'm like, no, this is actually a rejection of their way of being, the way they raised you, right? The way they show you love through food. It is a rejection. Because you're saying, if I agreed with you, I would eat what you eat. I am rejecting that choice. And that is a judgment, and it is a critical judgment, even if it's implicit. And we have to actually acknowledge that, because if we don't, you can't deal with like the hurt feelings, and you can't, right? And so this took me a while to understand. So when I left the church, I was lucky in a way, because I was the last of my siblings to leave. And so that was helpful. They each, for different reasons and different pathways, but my parents were very, very traditional in that way. And so it was painful for them, because you recognize it's not just that they love you and they raise you this way, but they literally think, right, in some level, that you could be going to hell when you die, right? That you won't be with them. And that's like,
so if you and this is the strange thing, right? If you believe those things, then it becomes the right thing to do, to be pretty controlling. And
that's right. That's right. And I think the good news is that they also had evolved over time, and they see, other people in the world who are good people who aren't Catholics. And so their worldview had opened as well. And it's interesting, because you also see that's where the cracks in theology are apparent, because it's like, well, I know you're a good person and you won't be going to hell. And it's like, okay, but that's not what the church says. So if we can disbelieve this about what the church says, then maybe we can disbelieve some other things, but I won't push it, right? But so that was challenging for my parents, because it wasn't just, you're not doing what I've told you to do. It's, you're not doing what I think is best for you.
Yeah.
And that hurts a parent, right? So that was challenging. The good thing for me was I was already out of college, right? And so my community wasn't so strongly identified. So there was some community, but because I had been questioning, because I'd been talking with people about this, it wasn't kind of shocking for anyone. So that part wasn't so hard. So the other big sort of framework change was, I had been studying, and then I began to study nonviolence, and that became my sort of theoretical, philosophical approach to the world. And so I thought, okay, so this is part of what I sort of take from what I've learned, but I do need to have some framing that through which I can make consistent choices, right? So I can, and so for me, that was the framework of nonviolence. And so I want to eliminate my complicity with violence as much as possible. I want to think about it both personally and systemically. And so that became my framework. And so as a college student, interestingly, went to college here in DC, and we would walk in front of the White House, and there were these people protesting all the time. And, as a freshman in college, I was like, people are crazy. Like, what are they doing? It seems like a little out of control. So it was very, very surreal when I decided to be one of the people to join them. And I was like really conscious of like, I am now being one of the people that my younger self thought was crazy. I am doing these nonviolent vigils right in front of the White House to protest the war, to stop the war from happening. And so that was a real line like that I was really intentionally crossing. And that was really hard for my mom in particular. She thought, it wasn't safe. It was like wacky, because she was still more of that mindset. And also for my friends, they were like, it's cool that you're like nonviolent, but this seems like a lot, right? That you're going to go that far. And then the third thing was, all the way to veganism. And it's just really hard to do that in a way that doesn't, because you sort of don't want to upset everyone around you. And on the other hand, you kind of want people also to be thinking about the things that you thought about that made you make this shift, right? And so you can't have it both ways. It's going to be uncomfortable. And so that was a bumpier move, right? Because food important in my family, all the gatherings, because now we were all out of the house, so we'd come back for holidays. And so food was really important. And so it was just disruptive. And again, it was a rejection of my mom, right? About like how she thought was the right way to cook and to feed people and to love people that way. And so it took us a little while before we realized that what was going on and that neither of us were handling it well. And then we kind of got past that, and now it's copacetic. But it's been, that was 3 or 4, 5 years ago. And we didn't even have the word vegan then, right? So the whole concept, people were like, you're going to get sick and you're going to, like,
Yeah.
people just had no idea. And it seemed really extreme. You were like, well, like, can't you? And I was like, no, like, that's leather and that's this. And people were like, what is wrong with you? And so it was a long time ago, and there wasn't a community, right,
Yeah.
of vegans to sort of jump into.
So
Yeah.
different from where we are today. I mean, we've got so far to go, but
Yes.
I have so much respect for people
Yes.
like you who took that step, a couple of decades back. And it's you've demonstrated perfectly how hard it is to separate the sort of what's real from this what matters question. And I'm not really a big fan of doing that. Some people think there should be a chasm between epistemology and ethics, and isn't all. But I think it unavoidably they're entwined together in very rich and positive ways. And I quite like that, because if our values and our ethics aren't grounded in reality, then what are they based on, right? And you do go back you're forced back to some sort of either arbitrary or relativistic or supernatural basis for them. And I'm like, I'd prefer them to be grounded in the real world and the experiences of sentient beings. But let's shift onto this what matters question that you've prefigured already, which is particularly apposite, I think, for someone who's moved away from a religious worldview, because with a religious worldview, they are explicitly packaged together. Here's the stuff you should believe about what's real, God, heaven and hell, angels, transubstantiation, whatever it is. And here's also the list of rules and the things you should follow, and ultimately often a rationale for those rules, which at its basis, while there's a lot of compassion in there, the root often is actually about obedience and submission. So the reason we're compassionate is because God tells us to love each other, not because it's intrinsically a good thing to do. And, the story of Abraham being told to kill his own son is, I guess, the canonical example of when it comes down to it, you do what you're told, right? So there's that package. But as we move away from that, there often is a challenge of like, okay, what do I do now? What is good and bad? What do right and wrong even mean? So was that part of the challenge for you as you moved away from Christianity, and where have you got to now as you think about the grounding, if you have a grounding for your morality? You've mentioned
Yeah,
nonviolence
it
already.
was. It was a challenge because it was easier, frankly, to rebel against, right, set of rules
Yeah.
than to create for myself a set of rules and to have some internal like coherence and consistency and to figure out. So for a while I was looking to just kind of replace with a better system. And then I realized that I was going to have problems with any system. And so, and that left me feeling a little adrift for a while. And it didn't feel like the sort of nonviolence theory framework could be sufficiently encompassing.
And some people go from that feeling to, and sometimes it's temporary, and sometimes I think they get stuck there, either to a sort of nihilistic approach where you say, look, I understand the world, but ultimately we're all quarks and quantum fields and physics, and nothing really matters at all, right? So you sort of give up on ethics, or you go to a relativistic approach that says, well, normatively, it's just what groups of humans happen to agree amongst each other at a point in time. Or, I mean, personally, I think they're both dead ends, but
Right. And neither of those felt good for me. So my husband, with his science background, was a little more like the quarks, this is what we are. And so,
yeah, yeah.
it kind of just
And we have
depends
no
on what
free
we
will
want
anyway, so it doesn't matter what you.
to.
Let's not go there, but yeah,
Right.
yeah, but
And so one of the things I realized was that to some degree, my searching for a system that felt more comfortable was an abdication of personal responsibility. Right. I was looking for something I could just go, all right, this is generally, and then I can listen to them and I don't have to do all of this hard thinking for myself. And I was like, you know what? Like, time to grow up and do the work. And so I really did a lot more reading, a lot more exploring, not just about other sort of faith traditions to figure out what seemed appropriate in terms of guidance about how to live your life, but and then non-religious, right,
yeah,
philosophy and writing, and so then I decided that this nonviolence framework was rich enough. It really answered the questions for me. So if the question is, do I do this or do I do that, right? If I have a choice, well, what's the choice that is better from a nonviolence perspective? Which one either adds more nonviolence to the world or deletes some violence from the world? Which one makes me less complicit in even systemic violence? And that's like a lifetime's work, right? Because it actually affects everything. And so expression of that now can be veganism as a lifestyle choice, right? So for me, because it flows from that nonviolent theory, so it's a do no harm for me. And so that is a really incredibly hard way to maneuver yourself through, especially a capitalistic society, right? Where systems of oppression are already so hardwired in. And so I say to my students all the time, I call myself a vegan, but it means I'm trying to be vegan all the time because, I'm sitting in an office that has paint on the walls, a rug on the floor that has animal, products in them. And I can look around, right? If I'm in a car, there are all kinds of, there's no way to completely 100% be pure. And so that keeps me humble, which is good. And it keeps me trying, which is good. And it keeps me, I think, empathetic.
Are you suggesting that being vegan doesn't immediately make you 100% perfectly ethical in every respect?
Yes, I am saying that.
Yeah, I agree
and
completely.
I'm also saying that no one can be, at least in the United States, 100% vegan. You just can't, right? So if you ride a bus because that's better for the environment, right, rather than car, that's still probably what's in the rubber on the tires, the paint on the bus, maybe the fabric on the seats. Like, you just don't even know. And so there is no way to be 100% vegan, and so nobody should get on their sort of moral high horse, so to speak.
I was being a little trite because there are plenty of vegans on Twitter, and I am one sometimes. You can sort of give that implication that we have arrived, perfection has been achieved, and we look down on the rest of the human race.
Well, and so this is where, so we used to call it the vegan police at Lewis and Clark. And so I used to be very upset with the vegan police. And so it usually didn't take too long of conversing with someone who was being judgmental of someone else to remind them, one, that they weren't vegan from forever, and two, they weren't actually 100% vegan. And so it's a journey, and we want to make it easier for people to join the journey and not be judgmental and say it's all or nothing, right? That's just, in my view, strategically even, it's not a wise way to go. I 100% understand when people go like, I got it, the light bulb came on, this is now how everyone should live, right? I made this choice, everyone should make this choice, and they should do it tomorrow. I understand that sort of zeal of the converted, and there's benefit to that passion. And so we want to kind of harness and support that passion at the same time addressing the judgment, right? Putting up these roadblocks to other people, even exploring what this is, right? Yeah. And again, my mother thought, she's like, you're starving yourself and you're being a martyr. Like, I'm not. I am rejecting things. I am letting go of things that I used to enjoy. And for a long time, vegan food, it was hard, right? But now we've got like chocolate and ice cream and pizza and stuff we didn't used to have. So that's, I think, right, the better messaging in getting to a world where it's easy, right? It shouldn't be hard to be good. Yeah. And that's a weird dynamic in a lot of religions, right? This martyr complex. And so I don't subscribe to that anymore, and I don't support that. I think we should make it easy and fun and good to be good.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, helpful. Yeah. And so
sense.
The confluence between
it becomes more of a joy and a release rather than a sacrifice.
That's right. I don't have regret. I don't have this feeling of guilt, right? I can release if I do every day the best I can do. I sleep well at night, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I will come back to that approach in a moment, if that's okay, because I think there are some risks with the journey approach as well and a softer approach, but I'm sure you're very conscious of them. But I want to ask a slightly odd question about this idea of non-violence. Why is violence a bad thing?
You're not the first person to have asked. And so people, especially when we talk about animals, we're like, there's violence in the animal kingdom. And it's like, so we have a choice, right? So this is where we get back to rationality. And so I think rationality comes with responsibility. And so what I say to people would also say, well, animals can eat animals. Why? And we're animals. They don't always recognize that part. But why can't we eat animals? And I said, because we have a choice. We can go to the grocery store and they can't. Really simple, right? Yeah. Same as if there's not vegan food in a country or in a city, like I'm not going to blame people for not eating it because it's not there, right? So we have choices. And we need to take those choices and act responsibly with them. So I don't think that, so to the degree that violence causes harm, right? Yeah. I would like to reduce the harm in the world, whatever that means, whatever that is. Am I going to go into a forest and protect, a prey animal from a predator animal? No, I'm not. because that is kind of how things are. And I don't usually like that kind of answer, right, in the human context.
Yeah.
But I recognize that we don't actually know enough about when we disrupt some of those natural cycles, what we do. So there are humans who will go, for instance, in dealing with, say, feral cats, right? Or removing, there are like coyotes in Chicago. And people are like, oh my God, there's coyotes. We need to like take them out of, like, they're in downtown Chicago. It's like, yeah, and they're not bothering anyone. You don't see them. You had to like read it in the newspaper to find this out, right? When you take them out, what you do is create competition for that territory. So now you're going to have more coyotes and you may have more conflict with humans. So when we try, right, to either reduce the violence or change the natural order, we end up messing things up pretty horrifically. So for the time being, I know that I don't know enough to sort of reduce that kind of traditionally natural violence in the non-human animal world. So I'm going to leave it be. But because we're already creating so much additional violence, even to those communities, those animal communities, I think we have a responsibility, right, to stop destroying the habitats, stop, creating more competition for food and those kinds of things, right? So there are things we can do to make that better and lessen that violence. But in a perfect world, right? If no animals had to eat other animals, cool. But I'm not even worried about that. I'm just worried about, we have so much known violence that we have responsibility for. That's my focus.
Makes sense.
So I don't know if that's an answer to like why violence is bad question.
Yeah, it is. And I think the core answer, which I guess is embedded in what you're saying, is that violence is bad because it causes harm, in a sense.
Yes.
And it's that harm, that suffering, that death, that is the core reason why violence is bad. And it's interesting because I think many people would go along with everything you've said about non-violence and avoiding harm. And, in a way, that's the core of a modern secular humanistic ethic, and what underpins human rights and so on, like needlessly causing suffering and death to humans is a bad thing. But they will often include that conditionality about to humans, either explicitly or more often implicitly, just in the back of their minds. And the idea of non-human animals won't even cross their minds. So why didn't you stop there with the human default of thinking about non-violence and do no harm within the human anthropocentric sphere? What was your journey to thinking seriously about non-human animals and recognizing that they can be harmed too?
So I think it was because as I was studying nonviolence, in that conversation, you sort of deal with the isms. So racism, sexism, homophobism, right?
Yeah.
And so I could look at, even at that point, my relatively young life and see what I had already been complicit in. And so you get to also speciesism. And so one of the things I didn't want was, very intentionally, I was like, I don't want to be able to look back and have someone go, oh, here's another ism we should have been thinking about.
You missed one.
But now, you missed one, right? So I'm like, let me go to the floor. Tell me all of it, right? I want to go to the floor and then I want to try and get right with it. And so that I can try to eliminate all of those kinds of isms behavior from my thinking and then from my acting. And so I was like, all right. So it took some exploration to figure out what that floor might be. And so, because especially at that time, there wasn't a conversation so much about the sentience of animals, right? We didn't have as much of the scientific data, but I was like, it just kind of makes sense. Like, right? If you kick a dog, right, that's not good. It's not good for you and it's not good for the dog. So either way, let's just reduce that because it's violence, right? So even if I'm like punching a rock, why am I punching a rock? That's not good behavior for me, even if we say it doesn't hurt the rock, right? So let's just eliminate violent behavior from the human side and not worry about who the victims are. And that was helpful for me. I was like, the victims of violence can be people, it can be the environment, it can be individual animals, right? But so we should protect victims of violence and victims from violence, but we should stop engaging in violence almost regardless of the outcome, right?
Yeah.
So it's just not good behavior and we should try to eliminate it as much as we can. And so with those frameworks, I was like, all right, so because people would say, well, what about plants? Like plants are alive. And I was like, well, my simple answer is you consume fewer plants if you consume them directly, right? Than if you funnel them through animal bodies. So I don't know whether it's, plants are sentient. There is some really interesting research now talking about like how grass evolves and trees talk to each other and all kinds of stuff. I don't know. And so again, I might as well be as protective as I can be, right? While that information may evolve, and again, be as less complicit, right? But at least, so that's still the framework that operationalizes, right, some of the activity and the choice making.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. And I think there's probably, I think we've probably come to a very similar place, but it is a slightly different emphasis. And that I get the sense that you're suggesting non-violence because it causes harm and suffering. And I guess I'm primarily starting from the suffering and death and the sentient beings. And that's why I think violence to them is a bad thing. And I think there's a big overlap between the two, but I think maybe there's a slightly different emphasis when we start to think about insentient entities there, because I'd also share this sort of epistemological humility about where are the boundaries of sentience. So sentientism doesn't tell us which entities are sentient. It doesn't have a strong stance on any species or plant or anything really. Right? There are some panpsychist sentientists. It just says, use a naturalistic approach to try and work it out with humility. That boundary may be fuzzy, it may shift over time as we learn more, but wherever it is and whatever it is, sentience is morally salient. So at least don't exclude any sentient being from moral consideration. So I'd share that sense of humility and fuzziness about where the edges are and thinking about plants as an example. But assuming we do have a clear distinction between an insentient entity and a sentient entity, I do see a very strong ethical difference there, in that I see a really powerful imperative to include the sentient being in our moral scope, but I don't see an imperative to include a rock or a river or a tree or the planet as Gaia. But I see those things as deeply important in many ways because of their interdependencies with the sentient beings and their impact on the sentient beings. Whereas I suspect that your approach to non-violence is a little bit more intuitively expansive than that, because you would say, if you don't need to punch a rock, why would you punch a rock in the first place, even if I'm super sure it's not? Whereas I'd be more confident saying that's just morally a neutral thing to do. Whereas I think your non-violent stance would say, well, okay, but why do it at all? And I'd probably agree, but so it's a subtle difference.
And I think there's some also inherent, maybe some distinctions in that. For me, sentience as a marker is very human-centric. Right. And so, right, the fact that we decide that this capacity, right, is what matters because it's our capacity, and we don't grant moral, awareness, right, to or protection of other beings unless they have this capacity that's important because we say it's important because we have it. And so we used to say other animals didn't have it. And now we're like, okay, all mammals have it. And now we're moving into the aquatic sphere, right? And so, again, the lack of our scientific even inquiry, the assumptions that our scientists have made for centuries about not even asking, not even looking, just not even assuming, just saying flat out scientifically they don't have it. Right? It's just stunning. And
this is even reasonably modern science. We're not going back to Descartes here, right?
That's right. That's exactly right. Right. And so, and interestingly, and people blame poor Descartes, and he has a lot to answer for, but like he was trying to move away from this religious answer to the question to some rationality, right? And so he was trying to pull that, and then he got it wrong, obviously. But we have scientists currently who are fighting this, right? It's not like we have a full, huge scientific consensus. We have consensus on some things, but not others. But we don't actually even understand the questions to ask about what capacities these other beings have. So they have some amazing capacities that we don't have for sight and sound and all kinds of processing, like the way an octopus, sort of neural function brains, in the different arms, like amazing, amazing stuff. And we tend only to investigate in terms of when there's human applicability, right? When there's a benefit. So if you want to, use like the stickiness of the suckers on octopus arms for, some NASA, implications, right? It's insane, right? And even then, when we find some capacity that is useful, it is insufficient to grant moral protection to those animals. And so I just feel like we need to break So the sentience is really, really helpful in the law, right?
Yeah.
Because it's something judges can understand. If they can feel pain, we shouldn't kick them like
Yeah.
unnecessarily. We shouldn't cause unnecessary suffering. So I use it for sure. And I want to complicate it and broaden the conversation because it's still so human centric. And it stops us from asking, I think, important questions. So for instance, we get back to the rock. So not only why punch the rock, but like say you punch the rock and you're going to move, or you kick the rock. All right, well, you have now probably changed the home environment for some animals, right? So who may or may not be sentient based on our current scientific understanding, right? And so things are connected, and you can't have the animals in the river without protecting the river. And you can't have a healthy planet, even for humans, without healthy water and soil. And so the work that animals do to maintain a healthy ecosystem is completely unrecognized, right? And so they, filter chemicals and toxins and pollutants both in the soil, and they aerate the soil, right? They do work without which we wouldn't have agriculture. We wouldn't have, right? Without pollination, we wouldn't have food. So trying to understand even so insects and other beings who are not deemed sentient right now, I think have an incredibly important role to play, even from a human use perspective, right? Even if we can't get people to care about the animals for themselves intrinsically, right? Extrinsically, they are essential for
Yeah.
the way that we have chosen to live on the planet. And so that should be enough to protect them. But it should also then add humility and say, okay, that these are amazing creatures and we should make space for them to be who they are, and then kind of observe what that might be and appreciate it.
Yeah,
Right.
I agree. And I think there are some dangers in over focusing on sentience in a naive way. And I have to be conscious of this because everything does seem to inexorably get drawn back to sentience for me. But and I think you've elucidated some of the risks there. One is that you forget those second, third, fourth, fifth, nth order, maybe infinite order interdependencies and that richness of connection. And then you do go back to this anthropocentric approach of only caring about the environment because of the ecosystem services we need and whether it gives us the right temperature and sea level, right? And so I think that's a dangerous oversimplification. And like you say, if you punching a rock disturbs some insects that might be impacted, then you should have a sentientist concern for that too. I also like the approach about the humility, and that's partly why I think this sentientist approach should be grounded in this evidence and reason idea that has that humility baked in. So it isn't, here's the list of sentient species and that's the end of the story. It's taking a naturalistic, humble, error correcting approach to trying to work that out. So we can look genuinely at insects and invertebrates and even plants with an open mind and weigh the evidence and have a sort of probabilistic provisional view, not a sort of dogmatic binary one. So I think that helps a little bit with the, drawing the line in the wrong place. But I think there's a deeper problem as well, which is we're so good at coming up with concepts and ideas that conveniently put ourselves back at the center of a picture, at the top of a pyramid, whatever. And sentience can be another one of those because, unavoidably we start from a human perspective. What else can we do, right? There's nowhere else really for us to start from. And in a way, our own sentience is the thing that each of us is most confident exists because that's what I'm feeling every moment now. So you can understand that being a starting point. But if sentience becomes a measure of how like us are these others, we've gone completely awry because to my mind, again, there's lots of scientific disagreement about this at the moment, but my favorite school of hypotheses is that sentience probably evolved in the Precambrian. So one, sentience has been around for many millions of years, hundreds of millions of years before humans even came on the scene. So it cannot be an anthropocentric marker and should not be an anthropocentric marker. And what that means in evolutionary terms is when you look around the world, us humans are a vanishingly tiny percentage of the sentient beings on this planet today. So again, casting it as an anthropocentric marker is a massive mistake. And some people do exactly that. And I've been in a number of fascinating conversations, both in this series, but also on Twitter with people like David Gunkel and Mark Cockleberg and Josh Gellers and others, quite often who come from either the environmental ethics worlds or, interestingly, the sort of robot rights, AI ethics world as well, who I think will do the sorts of things you're doing, where they're saying, look, be careful of these anthropocentric traps. Let's trouble the concept. Let's deconstruct it. Let's think about maybe relational approaches that might go further. Let's think about these interdependencies. And I guess where I've come to through those conversations is an acknowledgement that those are all valid and important challenges. But where I'm absolutely firm is that none of those arguments give any rationale for excluding any single sentient being from our moral consideration. And so I've almost tried to sort of reframe this sentientist idea as saying, look, it's not saying only sentient beings matter. It's just saying that all sentient beings should matter. And if you want to go beyond that, that's fine with me, but I'm much more worried about excluding sentient beings because they can, by definition, experience suffering than I am mistakenly including insentient entities. That's fine with me, if you like. And I guess a frustration I have is that I'd be interested in your response, but my guess is that you'd be with me on that. Every sentient being matters, absolutely. And you carry that through practically as far as you can through your veganism as an example. And there's no perfection there, but that's really clear. But then you want to trouble that boundary and go further and be more open-minded. Whereas most of the people, I think, I haven't done a statistical analysis, who want to go further through a relational approach or through thinking about rocks, rivers, and trees or the earth as Gaia, still explicitly, at least in practical terms, exclude most of the sentient beings from their moral consideration, either because of an appeal to nature fallacy or because social norms around how we treat farmed animals or whatever else it would be. And that's the thing that really gets my goat, right? Because I have people who are arguing vociferously for rights for rivers and mountains who still consume farmed animals without a moment's thought. And that's the disconnect I'm really struggling with. So that's, sorry for the sort of ranty lecture, but I'm interested in your views on whether we can mitigate those risks to a sentiocentric approach, and two, that challenge of people going further but excluding sentience.
Yeah, a few thoughts. So one of the things that I struggle with is a desire to help people just admit where they're at. And so for people who are coming from, say, the rights of nature perspective, but who eat animals, to make it easier for them to acknowledge that dissonance and to say,
yeah.
I understand this is a dissonance, and I understand that I should be changing my personal behavior. I'm just not there yet for these reasons or what have you. I would much rather people be able to say that, because it then allows for consistency in this theoretical approach, right? And
it's a step, right? It's the first intellectual step.
It's a step. That's right. And it allows people, and it's gives people space to one, be truthful rather than tie themselves up in knots, right? To give theoretical justifications for why we don't care about the farmed animals. That's really problematic, right? So let's not do that.
They end up almost being forced into reverse engineering and broken epistemology and ethics to justify something practical
exactly
that they don't want to reject.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so if we're less judgmental about the fact that there is this dissonance, we can maybe avoid that problem and say, all right, so yes, this in an ideal world, right? Your theory also includes these other animals, recognizing for the time being, there are significant challenges to putting into practice that theoretical approach in these contexts. And also entirely fair that you want to work on the environmental issues, like that's your issue and that's your career. You don't have to take everything on. That is perfectly appropriate. We need people with those specialties, but we just also need to admit theoretically, honestly, right, where we're at in this, both at the theoretical level and then at the personal level, and then give people space, right? And so I think that's at least one approach to harmonize, if you will, right, and make the pathways clearer, because when we muddy the waters and create pressure on people to be defensive and then to come up with justifications, right? It's just not helping anybody. It's not helping them. It's not helping. So that's one thing. Another thing that I'll note is that there's a particular power to the sentience conversation that offers sort of a light bulb moment and some empathy for people. So when people recognize in other beings that which they have in themselves, that creates an opportunity for kinship, right? That allows for potentially all kinds of other wonderful things. And there's power in that. There's real emotional and all kinds of power to that we want to kind of harness, right? So we want to say, yes, we're all part of the animal world, right? And we are more cousins than anything else. And so we need to reframe how we think of each other, but we can't begin to do that until we see something of ourselves in them. That's just apparently how human psyche works, right?
Yeah.
So let's acknowledge that and try and recognize and use that positively. Having said that, the flip side is, of course, we don't value anything that isn't like us, right? And we want to operationalize and sort of, capitalize literally on a utilitarian kind of method for approaching other beings in the world as resources for us. And so we have to recognize that there's, the power of it also comes with this inherent limitation. And so that limitation is obviously something that I want to trouble and say a couple of things. So none of us asked to be born. We're just here. And so we want protections for being who we are to the degree possible. And we get some, more or less, depending on where we live and who we are and sort of the ways in which we engage with the world. The same thing for animals. None of them the non-human animals, right, have asked to be born, and they're here. And together we are the world. And so just because we're here, I feel like there should be some protection. And that's for human beings, non-human animals, and frankly, for the plant world, right? Let's just pause on destruction and think about, right, if we can avoid some of that and then think about, learn more about how we are codependent, right? Learn how we're part of a system and that's a good thing, and try and figure out how to be generally protective of who and what is already here, right? And to some degree, then you don't need to figure out, well, they feel or they don't feel, right? Or because the other problem with scientists is it's not even just whether they feel like we feel, right? Is it that neurons? So part of the conversation with finfish in particular for a long time was, well, they don't have the same kind of neurological, biological framework that humans have. And it's like, it doesn't make any sense biologically that there would be a being in the world that doesn't have a way to sense harm and protect themselves from that harm. It just doesn't make sense biologically. So let's just flip the script, right? Assume that all beings, right? Insects, all beings have some protective capacity, which means they have some capacity to sense harm and then to protect against it. Going to be radically different, right? Especially if we want to talk about trees versus, right? But they do have ways to protect themselves from fire, right? From all kinds. I mean, it's pretty cool. And when we begin to break down the conversation sort of from that framework, we ask different questions. We explore different phenomena, and it leaves us open to have much, much broader and wider conversation, rather than saying the only thing that matters is the way we think and feel. And then we'll explore maybe, right, if other beings think and feel like we do, and then maybe we'll give them protection. But generally, even when we give them protections, it comes with a huge amount of caveats because, okay, so we like dogs, but we're going to also experiment on them. But we're also going to, use them as working animals, and and those are things that are fine, right? And so we like the natural world, but even people who want the natural sort of rights generally also are fine with fishing and hunting and, all kinds of human exploitive without even getting to mining or logging or those kinds of things. So
absolutely.
So this framing has been completely unsuccessful, right? And so I want to, on the one hand, recognize and harness the power of empathy that comes from kinship, that comes from a feeling of we share sentience. That's important, and I want to acknowledge that, and I want to use that, and I don't want to be bound by just that.
I like it.
I want to have these.
And I think that sort of scientific perspective on evolution is a really great way of applying that, because other people will tell a similar story, but they'll do it in a sort of spiritual, mystical, we are all connected way, which doesn't resonate with me. Whereas the evolutionary scientific context that talks about how we're all connected to a tree as cousins and all the way back, there will be some at least minimal way of understanding the environment and working out how to respond to that. I think it sort of gets you us to a similar place, but naturalistically grounded. So I like that. And I think you could still, draw distinctions about entities that had a certain degree of mobility, or one of my previous guests, Walter Wiet, has talked about this idea of pathological complexity. or Ginsberg and Jablonka use the ideas of unlimited associative learning, which are sort of steps along the evolutionary path where you can imagine this sense of subjective awareness and subjective experience of things, developing in a way that maybe weren't around before. But it's very clear that's still part of continuity. That there's no magical light goes on. And in that sense, the information processing that a tree and a network of fungi under the ground might be doing isn't, in some magical way, totally distinct from what the earliest, what I might think of as sentient beings are doing as well. And weirdly, without getting too sci-fi, that also takes me into a mode where I'm quite open-minded about the possibility of even artificial sentience, because ultimately I think that sentience and consciousness more broadly are likely to just be what it feels like to run certain patterns of information processing. So in the same way as you've suggested that, an octopus or an invertebrate or even a plant might have a way of doing information processing that runs on different hardware or different biology, conceptually, I don't see in principle why you couldn't run a sentience on, a silicon substrate too. But anyway, that's getting a bit broad. But I like, right. I like the way you frame that in a sort of evolutionary context that makes it, encourages us to be very careful about some of these fuzzy boundaries and drawing hard lines. So, yeah.
So, and I think from a legal perspective, if I can really quickly, on the one hand, again, I wouldn't need to decide whether it comes from spiritual or naturalistic view, because I just don't. But also, I can obviate that entire question. Sometimes just say they exist, right? Beings that exist, we deserve a conversation about what protections are appropriate. It doesn't matter how they exist or where they came from or a connection, just they exist. And so that just shortcuts the conversation. From a legal perspective, then, and then I don't have to care about what capacities they have, right? Just that they exist requires us to consider protections.
Yeah.
When we talk about what protections, that's when the capacities can come back into being a meaningful part of the conversation. Because if they have certain capacities for feeling harm, right, those are the ones that need protection, right? And if they don't have other kinds of capacities, those are ones we don't have to, at least right now, worry about. So that sets up a prioritization for how to think about protection in both the legal framework and sort of just the larger philosophical framework. And so that's a way that I can maneuver through those conversations sometimes quite quickly.
Yeah, I like it. And one of my previous guests suggested this approach of just granting rights to everything. And then you go, okay, and now what rights does that entity warrant? And that's based on the capacity. So if they have the capacity to suffer, they want some protection from being caused to suffer. And so you can always get to a similar place, but without following the properties first approach, you can just start much more universally. So I could talk to you for hours and hours, but I know we don't have too long left. But the final big question is, how can we make a better future? And again, we've been sort of hinting at and talking about that a lot throughout. But I guess, and you can go anywhere you like on how do you think about how we can drive towards a better future. The themes of nonviolence will come through, the role of the law will come through. And also the other thing you talked about, which is the disconnect between getting a sort of conceptual commitment to something and actually having that put into practice in a way that helps the vulnerable entities. So I'm just blathering on now because there's so much I could ask you here, but how do you think about generally, in the broadest sense, how can we productively try and make a better world for at least all sentient beings, if not even beyond that?
Yeah, so a couple of sort of categorical answers, and then I know we don't have a lot of time, so we can figure out how deep to go into any of this. So one is seeing animals as beings, right? That's just really crucial in the education space, in the science space, in the law space, right? So we just need to admit they are biological beings and that has lots of implications. And then we can begin to engage with what those implications are and how we need to respond. Yeah. So seeing animals as beings, and again, that's that everyone should be able to admit that. Then it, I guess that it makes people defensive. Yeah. It should be, right? And it does make people defensive because then they have to admit that they're doing things to beings that they may not feel comfortable admitting. But we should be able to get there. More science and better science, right? Because one of the things that scientists are not always great at is recognizing their implicit assumptions because they're so baked into the social milieu, right? They're just how they were educated in, whether they're religious or not religious, their home lives, their culture, everything leads to supporting these assumptions and making them invisible. And so we need to help really critically consider what are the fundamental questions and the fundamental assumptions that go into science so that we can have much better science, right? With basically both how we're using animals in science, which is really problematic and really needs to stop because we're not getting good answers, if not just because it's horrible to animals, but also then the scientific questions, scientific exploration that we're engaged in is limited fundamentally by these hidden assumptions. And so we need to work on that. Third sort of conceptual answer is education. So I'm a teacher. I believe in education. It keeps me hopeful, even in dark days, right? To see the students come in and to see the evolution, to see what I was taught, what I thought even when I began teaching, where I'm at now, right? It's still a whole journey for all of us.
Yeah.
And so that makes me hopeful that we can move forward. But it's really important to be sort of humble. We don't know all that we need to know, even as teachers, right? Any one of us, but seeking education, participating in education, continuing our education's changing this idea that you kind of go to school and then you're done learning, right? That learning is a lifelong endeavor, that we are all participating in one way or another, even if it's just reaffirming things we thought we knew politically, culturally, religiously, whatever that's ongoing education. And so again, surfacing that and saying we can also expand our learning, right? We can expose ourselves to different cultures, different ideas, different worldviews that will enrich our lives. Again, if we need to come at it from this sort of intrinsic beneficial constraint, fine. It's better for the world, I think, but there are reasons why we can encourage people to broaden and continue and understand that life is sort of education. So those are the three sort of conceptual ways forward, and we could talk about any of them. I know we're running low on time, so I'll let you decide where we go next.
No, that's great, thanks. Well, but I am interested in, particularly given the academic work you're doing, some of the activism too, is the role of the law within that. Because one of the things that makes me worry about this sort of maybe softer, we're all on a journey approach, is that as humans, we're quite good at finding dead ends there as well, right? We're always desperate for excuses to not change and just to keep doing the things we like to do. And we're brilliantly creative at coming up with those excuses. So the sorts of things I'm imagining are a process whereby, for example, really brilliant science is done. And there's a great example, and I know some of the authors, I've interviewed some of them in the UK around octopus and cephalopod and decapod sentience, where they did some really deep, powerful research, some of which unfortunately probably did involve harming the sentient beings. Really strong evidence that those entities were sentient and beings, as you say, subjects of a life and warranted moral consideration. The EU has included, recognition of widespread animal sentience in its law at that level, right? Major triumph, big step forward. But the second half of the report talks about, because of their obvious sentience, it's really important that we find more humane ways of farming and slaughtering. And as you can imagine, I think your response will be the same as mine. As you're reading this whole thing through, it's just a dawning sense of horror of, we've recognized the sentience, we've granted them moral consideration, and we're still trying to find some way of, in some way, shape, or form, even if it's slightly better welfare, carrying on with catastrophic exploitation, torture, and killing. And I'm not putting that at the door of the researchers, because I know many of their values see that as part of a process which will take us to a different place. But I do fear these human crafted dead ends where we pat ourselves on the back and we go, oh, look at our animal cruelty laws. Look at this wonderful regulation we've developed for animal testing. Look at the sustainable, happy, high welfare farming we now do at industrial scale around the world. Didn't we do well? And we've just found ourselves. So what's the role of the law in getting through that, information, education, science, lobbying, legislation, enforcement that actually makes a difference to the beings that need protection?
Yeah, so that's a very big question.
Sorry.
We don't have a ton of time. No, it's fine, but it's the right question. It's the right question to be asking. And so one thing the law can do is provide fora in which we can prove that some of what people are saying is happy farming, is good, better welfare, is false, just false. And frankly, that animal research is giving us much that's useful for human use at all, right? When we have 95% of the research, right, when we get into human models fail, right, after having been through 2 animal models. So we have data to show that the information that people are using in these contexts is just wrong, and they may not know it, right? It's wrong. And so therefore it cannot be or should not be the foundation for continued exploitation, right? So we can deconstruct that. Then the law is a space in which we can have that conversation. There's frameworks for that, whether it's legislation or courts. So that's one thing. We've created here at GW a law and science project. So Dr. Lori Marino and I have been working together for a couple of years, and we need, again, dedicated space where we can have these conversations about the role of science in the law, because lawyers and law students don't really know, and legal advocates, what science even means sometimes, right? Of where to find it and how to distinguish good science from bad science, and how to respond to other kind of, scientific justifications, right, that are poorly done. So we're going to be creating some resources, tools, and webinars for people to be able to use so that they can more ably in their own work use law and use science in the law, and then also understand the need to do that. So hopefully having this project will signal to people, right, this is something we all need to be doing. I also created a few years ago the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative, and that was to lift up, right, this whole segment of the animal world, which was not really seen even by animal advocates. Partly because, again, these hidden assumptions that they don't feel, or they're just not suffering in the same way these other animals are. And then when you say, well, if we're worried about, say, maybe 9, million land animals, terrestrial animals being slaughtered, well, how about the trillions of aquatic animals every year, right? So if we care about beings, and if we care about individuals, mind-numbing. And if you don't care about the animals, care about the environmental impact that's having. We're fishing, right, from the oceans, these animals, and we're fishing fish to feed to those fish, right? So not only are we creating additional factory farming horrors, we're doing it for carnivorous animals, which we haven't done in the land context before. So we're killing more animals to feed to these animals to then feed to us. It's
as if we didn't have too many trophic levels already. It's insane. Yeah.
Exactly. It's just literally insane. It does not make any sense, except for the people who are profiting off of these choices in the moment, because even they are putting themselves out of business because they just can't continue at the rate that they're going. So I think we need to be getting this factual information out to people. Like, even if you wanted to fish these animals, even if you wanted to factory farm them, octopus die after they give birth. Right. So that is an insane model for a factory farm, right? What are you doing? It's just, right. And so they're like, and we have this, again, human hubris, like, well, we can change the physiology to maybe make that not happen. It's like, when they're not octopi, like, what are you doing? So it's like, what we're doing is continuing down this path, trying to figure out how to do what we think we should be doing or want to do better and more efficiently, when we don't open ourselves up to, there's another path to get on. It's easier, it's more efficient, it's better for humans. And so the other thing that I'll say is, it as crazy as it is to use science to say that these animals can suffer, and so we should basically hurt them a little bit less, but create these ridiculous constraints where we're hurting them all the time. We do that to humans, right? And so we haven't figured out as human beings how to stop exploiting beings. And so we have a lot of work to do, and it's across the being spectrum, right? And so we have to acknowledge that we still exploit, we still put people in prisons. And, we just had a vote in the United States where 5 states were offered the opportunity to take slavery out of their constitutions, right? For involuntary servitude, having prisoners work for free. And 4 said yes, 1 said no. It's like, I don't even understand.
Yeah, it's 2022.
It's 22. Yeah. And it was only 5 states. We have, I think, a couple states who've already done it, but like, why haven't all the states done it? Right. So it's just a measure, right, that we have so much work to do. And everyone needs to be pitching in where they can and as they can. But yeah, it's not going to be a linear, progression in the way that we want it to be. Progress never is. Doesn't mean that we don't fight against it. And this sort of, like, everyone on the journey, for me, is sort of a hopeful way. But then the law is like, okay, but there's times I'm not going to wait for you. We're going to pass a law and say you have to do something.
Yeah.
Sorry. Like, you may not be there, but we're there. So, get on board. And that's where we deal with enforcement. Right. And so the lovely sentiment in the EU framing document, right, about the sentience that animal have to be considered. That, their interest in determining legislation is lovely. It just hasn't been operationalized, right?
Yeah.
So we have sometimes, that's a better law than we have in the US. But in the US, sometimes our lesser laws are a little bit better enforced, and sometimes they're not, right? So we have this spectrum within the legal system of saying, okay, there are times we're going to tell you what is the floor, and you can't go below. You can't kick the dog, and you can't, carve up the animal in the lab for no reason at all, right? We can put some boundaries, and then we're going to have to be serious about following up on this. And that's just, bit by bit. It's just a really slow process. So you have to be really patient when you're in the law, because you can't get these huge evolutionary or revolutionary changes overnight. But you can have statements that matter, right? So I tell my students about the statement in the EU, right? Like, wouldn't it be nice if we had that kind of statement in some of our legislation? And so exactly. And so you take hope where you can, right, from systems all around the world. And again, indigenous cultures, right, and other places that are often overlooked, that are sources of hope, that haven't fully adopted, right, these capitalistic, exploitated systems, right? And we could go, okay, like, let's just, again, maybe try something new, or old, and be respectful and be engaged in conversations in a much more broad way than we have been. In that I think is sort of the only way forward I know how, right? So we just keep going as best we can.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's hard, but change is possible. So, yeah.
Exactly.
Well, thank you. I could talk to you for hours more. And in particular, I wanted to ask you, how does non-violence deal with fascism? But that would take us for at least another 3 hours. So let's leave that there for the moment. It's been a real inspiration to talk to you, understand your philosophical journey and how you're trying to make the world a better place. So thank you so much for joining Sentientist Conversations. What's the best way of people following you, reading your papers, staying up to date? Do you do any social media or?
I don't do much social media. I'm probably going to begin to do some in my new position here. I have papers in some of the academic fora, research and academia and places like that. And I've got my faculty page at GW is a place to keep. And we're going to be building out the animal law programs website here at GW. So with events and that sort of thing. And we'll have the Animal Law and Science Project. We'll have, we're working with a high school. We'll have information about that. We'll have some aquatic animal stuff. So we'll be building that platform out. People will be able to find out some of the information about what we're up to.
That's brilliant. I'll include all the links in the show notes. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you again. I'll let you get on with the rest of your day. Please stay in touch, and thank you for all of your work.
Cheers,
Thanks
Kathy. For having me. I look forward to talking to you. Okay. Bye-bye.